Welcome, brave souls, to a night of mystery and terror. Are you ready to step into the darkness? Hold your breath, because tonight's story will haunt you long after the lights go out.
Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Look, I know the bathroom at Dead and Roasted has been haunted for the last decade. There's nothing I can do about it. The employees are just gonna have to use the dumpy dumpster in the alley, and there's always fresh roadkill out there for an easy cleanup. Speaking of workplace hauntings, today I've got some scary ghost stories for you, featuring railroad demons, pig plant phantoms, and, of course, a bathroom haunted by a ghost. These are tales from the break room. And this is my new book, Creepy Campfire Stories, which comes out on July 8th, 2025, but you can pre-order now on Amazon. The book is a gorgeous and thrilling collection of scary outdoors-related stories of the unexplained. It makes a beautiful and haunting addition to your bookshelf, but it's also the perfect tool to make your next campout something that your friends and family, and even the eavesdropping skinwalker nearby, will never forget. Pre-order now with the link in the description or by searching for Creepy Campfire Stories by Darkness Prevails on Amazon to help me get to 2,500 pre-orders before July 8th. Thank you. Now let's get on to those stories. Demon on the Tracks. From Inspector. I started working with a particular railroad company back in '86, inspecting tracks in the northwestern region. Most people don't understand how much maintenance railroad tracks need. These massive steel rails carrying tons of cargo every day expand, contract, warp, and wear down in ways that need constant monitoring. That's where I came in, as a track inspector, walking miles of isolated rail, looking for problems before they caused derailments. I'm getting close to retire these days. My sister-in-law tells me I should write down some of my experiences while my memory is still sharp. Mostly I think she means the stories I tell her kids about. Wildlife encounters, some of the strange characters you meet in remote rail towns. But there's one experience from the summer of '88 that I've never shared with them. Never shared with anyone, except my supervisor at the time. And he transferred to another division not long after. Back then, I was 32. 2 years into the job and still trying to prove myself. I was a single guy, dated here and there, but nothing serious. But my brother Christopher had died 8 months earlier. A sudden aneurysm at 38, leaving his wife and 3 kids under 10. I spent most of my off days helping her out, taking my nephews to Little League games and my niece to her dance classes, trying to fill in for Christopher where I could, though nobody could replace him. That June, I got assigned to inspect a 40-mile stretch of track, cutting through a remote area of eastern Montana. The line had been reporting unusual wear patterns that didn't match normal usage. My job would be to walk sections of it with specialized equipment, taking measurements and documenting any anomalies. I checked into a small motel in the nearest town, about 20 minutes or so from where I'd be working. Just a basic place with wood paneling and scratchy bedspreads. But it did have hot water, and it was clean enough for me. The woman at the front desk perked up when I mentioned I'd be working on the rail line. She asked which section, and when I told her, her expression changed slightly. She mentioned that her grandfather had helped build that stretch back in the early 1900s. He always claimed it was cursed ground, that the original survey team had all died under strange circumstances after plotting the route. I nodded politely, but didn't put much credit to it. Every small town has stories like that. Railroad folklore is full of ghosts and curses. Comes with the territory of a job that's claimed a lot of lives over the decades. My first day on site was uneventful. The rails looked normal at first glance, but my measurements showed subtle deformations that couldn't be explained by normal wear and tear. The patterns were very symmetrical, though, appearing at exactly the same intervals for nearly a quarter mile in what we called Section 42. The precision was what bothered me. Nature doesn't really work with that kind of regularity, and neither do train wheels. I also noticed my equipment behaving strangely in that section. The electronic measuring devices would fluctuate wildly, and my fully charged batteries drained to nothing in under an hour. I had to switch to manual tools, the old-school calipers and levels that railroad men had used for a century. It was approaching dusk when I first saw him. I was taking measurements about halfway through the section, kneeling beside the rail with my back to the setting sun. When I stood and turned to check my notes, I noticed a man standing beside the tracks about 100 yards ahead. That alone wasn't cause for alarm. It wasn't unheard of for locals to walk along the tracks, though this was a particularly remote stretch. What caught my attention was his clothing. He wore what looked to be a suit, but cut in a style that seemed decades out of date. Not quite an antique, but definitely not current 1980s fashion at the time. In the fading light, I could not make out his features very well. I called out a typical greeting. The distance was too great for me to see his expression change if it did, but something about the way he stood shifted subtly. He seemed to straighten up, his posture becoming unnaturally rigid. I took a few steps towards him. Then I saw his smile, visible even at that distance, just really wide and gleaming. I looked down just for a second to close my notebook, and when I looked up again, I swear to you he was gone, just like that. The landscape didn't really offer anywhere to hide, just flat terrain with sparse vegetation. No one could have moved out of sight that fast. I finished my work for the day and drove back to the motel, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe a hiker who had ducked down behind the rail bed. Maybe a trick of the light, making a natural object look like a person. The rational explanations didn't quite fit, but they were better than the alternative. That night, I dreamed of the same man standing at the foot of my bed, just staring and smiling at me. I woke up sweating at 3 a.m., and I could not go back to sleep. The next morning, I called my supervisor, reporting the unusual measurements from Section 42. But I didn't mention the man I'd seen. My supervisor said the readings were concerning enough that he was sending another inspector to work with me for safety reasons. Rail integrity in remote areas isn't something the company takes lightly. A derailment in the middle of nowhere can cost millions and potentially dozens of lives. My partner arrived late that afternoon. Funny enough, everyone called him Goob. He was an experienced and heavy-looking inspector in his late 40s. He'd been working here far longer than I had. I asked about his nickname while we were driving to the site. He explained it referred to a snack he always carried, homemade goobers, that he offered me from a paper bag. They were some kind of sweet, nutty cluster. Tasted pretty good, but when I asked for the recipe, he just winked at me, said it was a family secret. Goob was exactly what you'd expect from a career railroader. Knowledgeable, no nonsense about safety procedures, but full of colorful stories about his years on the job. He was good company as we worked through the measurements in Section 42. After what I saw, I was glad to not be alone for a while. The equipment issues continued. Goob's devices malfunctioned in exactly the same way as mine had, and his watch stopped completely when we entered the section, starting again right when we left. Bizarre, huh? He frowned at this, but didn't comment beyond saying he'd never seen anything like the wear patterns we were measuring. We broke for lunch around 1 p.m., sitting on some maintenance blocks near the tracks. I was mid-bite into some kind of sandwich when I spotted him again, the smiling man. He stood about 200 yards down the track watching us. This time he was in broad daylight, so I could see him much more clearly. He wore a dark suit with a vest, hair neatly parted, and that same unsettling smile fixed to his face. His skin was pale, almost waxy looking, even from that distance. I nudged Goob and pointed, asking if he was seeing this man watching us. Goob squinted in that direction and shook his head, saying he didn't see anybody. So I described the man's appearance. Then Goob's expression got weird. He asked if I was sure about the clothing. When I confirmed it, he packed up his lunch quickly, suggesting we move to another section and come back to this one later. As we walked away, I glanced back. The man was gone again. That evening at the motel, Goob and I reviewed our findings over beers in my room. When the technical discussion was done, I pressed him about his reaction to my sighting earlier. He was reluctant to talk about it, but finally shared that his grandfather had worked this same rail line back in the 1930s. His grandfather had quit railroading suddenly after an inspection trip on this very section, refusing to ever discuss what happened except to say he'd seen things that couldn't be explained. The family had assumed he'd witnessed a bad accident or found a body along the tracks. But my description of the man in outdated clothes with an unusual smile had triggered something in Goob's memory. A conversation overheard as a child when his grandfather had had too much to drink at a family gathering. I showered after Goob left for his own room. The bathroom was tiny, with just a shower stall and a plastic curtain. I was rinsing shampoo from my hair, eyes closed, when I felt something change in the air. Maybe a drop in temperature, I don't know. But I opened my eyes, and I saw a distinct silhouette through the shower curtain. Tall, motionless, standing just on the other side. I yanked the curtain aside in panic, sending soap bottles clattering. But the bathroom was empty. The door was still locked from the inside, exactly as I'd left it. Sleep didn't come easily that night. The following morning, Goob looked rough. He admitted to feeling nauseated and having a splitting headache. He also mentioned feeling like someone was watching him all night, despite being alone in his room with the blinds drawn and door locked. After a couple of hours attempting to do some work, he decided to head back to base, promising to send another partner if available. Before leaving, he pulled me aside, away from the tracks. His usual tone was gone. He explained to me his grandfather had worked this section alone after his partner quit unexpectedly. Whatever happened afterward was bad enough that the family never spoke about it. Goob warned me to be careful and to consider requesting a transfer to another section. Then he added something odd. He asked if I had a brother. When I mentioned Christopher, who had passed recently, Goob nodded like this confirmed something to him. But then he just got in his truck and left. I continued my work, alone now, methodically documenting the anomalies in Section 42. My unease grew as the day progressed. The feeling of being watched got worse until it felt almost physical in a way, like pressure on the back of my neck. One late afternoon, I was kneeling to check a particularly unusual wear pattern when I heard footsteps on the gravel beside the track. Looking up, I found myself face to face with this smiling man, now standing less than 10 feet away. Up close, he looked even more wrong. His suit was immaculate, but clearly from a different era, with a pocket watch chain visible across his vest. His skin had a bloodless quality that no living persons should have. But it was his face that froze me in place, features that initially seemed normal, but became increasingly unsettling the longer I looked. His smile revealed too many teeth, perfectly straight and white. And his eyes, I could swear they were normal when I first looked up. But as he stared at me, they seemed to darken until they were solid black, like dark ink being dropped into water. He then spoke, saying a name, but not my name.
Christopher.
I corrected him immediately, explaining that Christopher was my brother, and he was dead. The words left my mouth before I could even think better of engaging with this whoever or whatever it was. His smile widened, as if that was even possible. Then he simply said,
Wrong, brother.
It was a voice that sounded like several people speaking in unison, but slightly out of sync. The blast of a train horn broke the moment. I turned instinctively toward the sound, and when I looked back, you guessed it, the man was gone. The eastbound freight rattled past minutes later. The engineer gave me a casual wave, as inspectors are a common sight along the tracks. After the train passed, I found my notebook lying open on the ground where I'd been working. Flipping through it, I discovered page after page filled with the same phrase repeated in handwriting not my own. Wrong brother, wrong brother, wrong brother. I finished my inspection as quickly as I could, then drove back to my motel. I was too shaken up to even consider stopping for dinner. In my room, I called my supervisor from the bedside phone and reported everything. The measurements, the equipment failures, and yes, the man with the impossible smile who knew my brother's name. To his credit, my supervisor didn't just dismiss my claims. He asked some questions about the rail conditions and promised to send a full team to inspect the section properly. I was so exhausted I didn't have trouble sleeping that night, except when I was awakened at 3 a.m. Something felt wrong. The bedside lamp was on, but I was sure that I had turned it off. On the nightstand were several small items arranged in a circle. My brother's pocket knife, with his initials engraved on it, a silver dollar he'd carried as a lucky charm, and his wedding ring. These were not items I just carried with me. None of them should have been in my motel room. The knife and coin were in a box of Mike's possessions, which I kept in my apartment. The ring, though, that had been buried with him. I checked out at first light, and I never went back to that section. I finished my reports, and that was that. 6 months later, I heard through company channels that a freight train had derailed there, despite the repairs that had been done after I left, but I wasn't told the exact cause. Last month, my nephew, I'll refer to him as James, Christopher's oldest son, who's in his 40s now with his own kids, was helping me clear out some old boxes from my garage. He found a folder of sketches I'd made during my early railroad days. Mostly technical drawings of track components, but mixed in was a rough sketch I'd done of a smiling man. James asked who it was. When I saw it, it was instantly and terrifyingly familiar. I told him it was just some random guy I'd encountered on the job. But then he said something that alarmed me. Told me that his 10-year-old had been drawing a similar-looking figure for a while. A man with a very wide smile, black eyes, and a suit from an older era. I don't know what any of this means. I don't know what that man is, or why he's fixated on my brother. But he better leave my freaking family alone. Phantom of the Pork, from Fierce Pierce. You might think of this story as just another small-town ghost story, but I'm here to tell you it's something more than that. Keep in mind, the exact names of places and the plant and people have been changed. It was in the early 1990s, my family packed up our lives and headed to the Oklahoma Panhandle. I was laid off from my job in Kansas City. and the economy there wasn't giving me many options with 2 young daughters to feed. My wife, Cheryl's cousin, mentioned they were hiring at a pork processing plant out in Gaimon, and we were desperate enough that it sounded like opportunity knocking. We found a decent 2-story rental on the outskirts of town. 3 bedrooms, faded wallpaper from the 70s, and squeaky floorboards that announced every midnight trip to the bathroom. The girls, Melissa, who was 8, and Jenny, who was 6, shared the upstairs bedroom with the window overlooking the backyard. They were young enough back then that moving was still an adventure rather than trauma. Thank goodness. The day we arrived, our neighbor dropped by with a casserole and warnings about the August heat. She told us we'd picked a heck of a time to move to the Panhandle while fanning herself on our porch. She mentioned we'd toughen up by winter when the wind comes sweeping down and freezes everything it touches. Westland Pork Processing was a short drive from our house. The place was enormous. Imagine all corrugated metal, concrete, and industrial efficiency, sitting isolated on the flat landscape like a butcher's fortress. On my first day, the plant manager, I'll call him D, gave me the tour, shouting over the mechanical din. He bellowed proudly about how they process about 16,000 hogs a day, sounding more like he was telling me about his children's accomplishments. He explained I'd be working the cutting floor. Pay would be about $11 an hour, with overtime available most weeks, and health insurance would kick in after 90 days. The work was brutal. I'm no slouch. I had done physical labor before, but nothing like the repetitive strain of processing work. My shoulders and back screamed after each shift. The smell, though, that was something else entirely. It sank into everything. Clothes, skin, hair, the insides of your nostrils. It was a mixture of blood, offal, disinfectant, and something else that I couldn't quite place. Maybe just the meat itself, about to turn. Every night I'd come home reeking of it. My daughters thought it was gross and hilarious. Jenny would shriek that Daddy smelled like hot dogs gone bad, holding her nose dramatically, while Melissa doubled over with laughter. Cheryl was less amused. She'd tell me daily to strip in the garage, put clothes straight into the washer, and shower before touching a thing. All in all, though, I was happy. We were gonna make it. The pay was good and steady, we were catching up on bills, and the girls were adjusting well to their new school. You can't work in a place like Westland without hearing stories, though. In the break room during smoke breaks, in the locker room, everywhere the men gathered, there would be stories. Much of it was just the usual workplace stuff. Gossip about affairs between floor managers and line workers. Which person was a kleptomaniac? Which of our supervisors was a pushover? It didn't take long for me to hear one story that would keep resurfacing in different versions. I first heard it from M, who had been at Westland for 15 years and worked one station down from me. We were eating lunch when he nudged me and nodded toward an older section of the plant, visible through the break room window. He mentioned, between bites, that the area used to be the main kill floor back in the 70s, and that's where old Harold Weiss bought it. I asked what he meant by bought it, still new enough to be confused by their jargon. M looked at me like I was dense. He said that bought it meant he died. He lowered his voice to tell me it happened around 1976 or 1977. He said Harold Weiss was about 60 and had worked there most his life. According to the story, Harold had tripped and fallen into one of the grinders, with nothing left to bury but his left boot. I grimaced. That's the kind of thing that grosses me out. I said it sounded awful. M told me it gets worse, clearly enjoying having a fresh audience. He explained that some folks believed Harold didn't trip, but was pushed by a certain other man who was allegedly having an affair with Harold's wife. It was funny. I remember my first thought being, 60-year-olds getting in love affairs? Hope I have that much energy when I'm that age. He told me that this guy worked the same shift with Harold and had the perfect opportunity, though nothing was officially proven. Over the next few weeks, I heard various renditions of Harold's demise. In some versions, it wasn't a grinder that got him, but an industrial saw, if that's any better. In other versions, Harold had caught his sleeve in a conveyor belt that dragged him into the machinery. The details would shift, but certain elements seemed to be consistent. Harold was an older man, his death was always gruesome, and many believed it wasn't accidental. C, another coworker, asked me one day if I'd ever heard noises coming from the oldest part of the plant at night. I told him I couldn't say I had, though I'd only worked one night shift so far. C nodded seriously at me, warning me that I would eventually hear something. He explained that the maintenance crew wouldn't go in there alone after dark, because they claimed to hear footsteps and machinery turning on all by itself. He added that one guy swore he saw Harold himself standing by his old workstation just staring. I laughed. Every workplace has its ghost stories. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't glance more often at that old section of the plant after hearing these tales. It happened about 4 months after I started. I was working a double shift because we were short-handed, tired enough that the edges of my vision were starting to get fuzzy. I was heading to the bathroom, taking a shortcut through a rarely used corridor that connected to the older section of the plant. The floor was wet due to some condensation, always a hazard when you're in food processing, and I was being very careful with my footing. I was about halfway down the corridor when I felt it. A distinct pressure against my ankle, like someone had stuck out their foot trying to trip me. I stumbled forward, arms pinwheeling as I tried to catch my balance. To my right was an inactive grinder. It may be inactive, but I'd still be hurt or even killed falling into there like that. For a split second, I was certain I was going in, could already feel the metal against me. My heart lurched into my throat as I managed to catch myself against the wall, fingernails scraping against the concrete as I regained my balance. Panting, I spun around, expecting to see someone, maybe a coworker, laughing. But the corridor was empty, completely empty. I stood there, trying to catch my breath, staring at the empty space where I'd felt that contact. The light directly above that spot chose that moment to flicker out, plunging me into darkness. I called out then, asking if someone was there. It was hard not to sound scared and a bit panicked. I didn't get a response. All I heard was the distant machinery from the active side of the plant. I told myself I was tired, that I'd slipped on the wet floor and imagined the contact. But as I hurried back to the main floor, giving the grinder a wide berth, a cold certainty settled over me. Something had tried to trip me, something I couldn't see. I didn't tell Cheryl about what happened at the plant. She was stressed enough with her job hunt and getting the girls settled in, and honestly, I thought I'd imagined it. Exhaustion plays tricks on the mind, you know. But about a week later, something happened at home. I was alone in the kitchen on a day off, washing dishes while Cheryl took the girls to their new doctor for checkups. The radio was playing low, a country station that was one of the few we could pick up clearly. I was elbow deep in soapy water when I felt something. A firm push right between my shoulder blades. It wasn't violent, but it was substantial enough that I lurched forward, stomach hitting the edge of the sink. Water splashed up, soaking the front of my shirt. I spun around, heart pounding. The kitchen was empty. I called to see if anyone was there, feeling foolish that I even did. But the house was silent, except for the radio and a steady drip from a leaky faucet. After that, I checked every room, convinced we had an intruder, but all the doors were locked, and the windows were just fine. There was no sign of intrusion. When I got back to the kitchen, I didn't feel very comfortable. Just then, the radio cut to static, a harsh burst of white noise that made me jump up. When I tried turning the dial, it went right back to the country station, as if nothing had happened. These incidents went on, small at first. Items moved from where we'd left them, cold spots in random areas of the house, the distinct feeling of being watched while showering or changing. I tried to make sense of it, but how do you do that? Was the house settling? Was it on some sort of high magnetism ground, if that's even a thing? But I just couldn't fully explain it. The pushes continued too. Always from behind, always when I didn't expect it. Once when I was in the garage getting tools. One time when walking up the stairs. There was an incident when I stood at the stove cooking dinner and I felt that push again. It was never harmful, not yet, but it was persistent, like someone trying to get my attention. After a month of these occurrences, I finally mentioned something to C during lunch break. I didn't tell him everything, just some vague comments about feeling strange at the plant, about how I felt like someone had tripped me that first time. C shook his head and laughed a little bit, acting like he'd told me, and to his credit, he was right. He leaned across the table and lowered his voice. Surprisingly, he asked if anything had happened at home yet. My mouth went ajar. I asked him how he even knew that. C sat back and crossed his arms. He told me it was Harold, that it had to be. "You mean the guy who died in the accident?" I asked. He confirmed with just an and explained that it doesn't happen to everybody, but those Harold takes an interest in. He trailed off and just sort of stared at me for a moment. Then he said that I kind of looked like Harold. Something about my eyes and jawline. I was starting to get creeped out. I told him that was ridiculous. He said, "Maybe, but there's a photo of him in the hallway by HR if you want to check. Part of that memorial wall for workers who died. Check it out if you don't believe me." So I did that very afternoon. The memorial wall was modest, a collection of framed photos with small brass plates noting names and their years of service. Most were formal portraits or candid shots from company picnics. Harold Weiss's photo was toward the end, a color photograph from what looked like the mid-70s. He had thinning gray hair, deep-set eyes, and a prominent jaw. The brass plate read simply, Harold Weiss, 1916 through 1976, 30 years of service. C was right. There was a resemblance. Nothing dramatic, we weren't twins or anything, but enough of a similarity to be striking. Same eye color too, same jawline. Even the way our left eyebrow arched slightly higher than the right. I stared at the man's photo, and for a moment, I could have sworn his eyes looked at me. It startled me enough I nearly collided with a passing secretary. Sorry, I mumbled, and I hurried away. The activity at home intensified after I saw Harold's photo. Maybe he knows that I know. The pushing became more frequent and stronger. We even started to hear doors slamming without any draft. The television turned on a few times on its own, straight to static, right in the middle of the night. Our girls complained about bad dreams, where an old man stood at the foot of their beds, watching them sleep. Cheryl was starting to notice. "What's going on with this house?" she asked one evening, after a shelf of dishes crashed down for no apparent reason. Is this place haunted? Surely not, I lied, helping her clean up the broken pieces. It's just an old place, a bit unstable and creaky in places. I was very wrong, and the worst was yet to come. On a Tuesday night in November, I had just gotten home from work. I was in the shower, trying to wash away the smell of the plant. Cheryl was downstairs making some dinner. The girls were in their room, supposedly doing homework. I had just turned off the water when I heard screaming. Not normal kid screams. These were screams of terror, turning my blood to ice. I threw on a towel and ran out, nearly slipping on the wet floor. The screams were coming from the girls' bedroom. Cheryl was already at their door, pulling on the handle and screaming back, asking what was wrong. She shouted when she saw me that the door wouldn't open, that it was locked, and the girls were screaming. I yelled for the girls to open the door while rattling the handle myself. Melissa's voice came through high and panicked, telling us they couldn't open it, that it was stuck. She cried out that there was a man at the window. Ginny was just screaming, her voice going hoarse. We'd never installed locks on the upstairs doors. There was no physical way that door should have been locked. I told Cheryl to stand back before ramming my shoulder against the door. Pain exploded across my collarbone, but the door didn't budge. I tried again and again. On the fourth try, something splintered, and the door flew open. Both girls were huddled in the corner farthest from the window, clutching each other and crying. The window itself was wide open, cold November air gusting into the room, the curtains billowing. I rushed over to them while Cheryl closed the window. I asked what happened and who had opened the window. Ginny hiccuped through her tears that it was this old man, that he was outside looking in at them. Cheryl said that would be impossible since we were on the second floor, and she would be right. Melissa insisted with a face pale from terror that the man was really there. She explained that he told them to come outside, saying that they should just climb out and he would catch them. I went over to the window myself. I leaned out and took a look. There was no ledge, no tree branch close enough for anyone to stand on. Just a straight drop to the frost-covered yard below. "See? No one there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady for their sake, even as dread pulled in my stomach. "You girls were having a nightmare or something. That's all." Ginny denied it, saying they weren't sleeping. She explained they were doing their spelling when the door slammed shut and they couldn't open it. Then the window opened by itself and the man was right there. Her voice dropped to a whisper as she added that he looked like me, but older, angry. I looked over at Cheryl. Her face said it all. What in the world was going on? That night we all slept in the living room. The girls were smushed between us on the pull-out couch. No one said much, but I could feel Cheryl's questions building up in her head, waiting until the girls were asleep to spill over. "This isn't just an old settling house," she said, whispering so as to not wake the girls. "Something isn't right." I should have told her everything then, about the incidents at the plant, the pushes at home, Harold's photo and our resemblance, but I was terrified she'd think I was losing my mind, so I just agreed that something seemed off about the house and suggested we look for a new place. After Cheryl fell asleep, I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling. I felt guilty for not telling her everything, and it never stopped feeling like there was another person in that room with us, something that was terrorizing my family now. Over the next week, we stayed in hotels, frantically searching for a new place. I called in sick to work, using up precious sick days I'd been saving. The activity seemed to lessen when we weren't in the house, which reinforced Cheryl's belief that the problem was with the building itself. I finally returned to work the following Monday, exhausted and on edge. When I saw C again, he talked to me, asked if things were getting better or worse. Too tired to lie, I told him the truth, that the ghost had tried to get my kids to jump out of a second-story window. You should have seen C's face then, completely shocked. I told him I needed to quit this place and move away again, far away. C agreed, somewhat sadly. He told me that Harold's spirit seemed angry and always had been, but he'd never seen him do this before, and I didn't like the sound of that. Luckily for me, that day would be my last day at Westland. I told the floor manager I had a family emergency and wouldn't be back. And I wasn't lying. As I walked to my car, I passed the old section of the plant. I felt like I had to do it, so I spoke out loud to the seemingly empty room. "Harold, I'm sorry for what happened to you, but please leave my family alone." I then hurried to my car and didn't look back. We moved to a place 3 hours away from there, ended up getting a job at a post office. Pay was much worse, but it had regular hours, and there was no hauntings and no ghosts trying to hurt my children. Life went back to normal, and it's been normal ever since. I hate that apartment. From Rickham. My job brings me to a certain place that I have to go to because it's my job, but I hate it. That would be apartment 412. I clean apartments for a property management agency. When tenants move out, I go in with my supplies, clean everything top to bottom, take photos for the leasing agent, and move on to the next one. Most apartments do have their quirks. Some have water damage, others have carpet stains out the wazoo that won't come out no matter what you use. Then there's the one where people forget things, and you get to take home a little souvenir. Just kidding. I have to call management and let them know that something was left, so that the old tenants get a chance to get it back. But there is one unit I dread seeing on my work order, and yet it's my most frequent. Apartment 412. This unit has had more tenant turnover than any other property I've ever serviced. People typically stay maybe 3 months, 4 at the most, then break their lease suddenly. The property manager has told me they think it's the street noise, or maybe pesky plumbing issues. But I know better. I've been in that apartment at least 8 times in the past 2 years, and every visit, something happens. The first time it happened, it was subtle. I was doing my usual routine. Kitchen first, then bathrooms, bedrooms, living areas. About 20 minutes in, I heard something. It sounded like breathing. Not loud, just the soft in and out you'd hear from someone sleeping. I checked every room, thinking maybe the tenant was still there. Could have even been a squatter. But there was no one. The entire apartment was empty. But I swear the breathing followed me from room to room, sometimes from behind, sometimes beside me. And the feeling of being watched was so intense that I kept spinning around, expecting to see someone there. I rationalized it. Old ventilation system. Pipes. My imagination after a long day. But I worked double time to finish the apartment, skipping my usual break. The second time was about 4 months later. New tenant had moved out after only 10 weeks. The apartment was a mess. Looked like they up and left in a hurry. I set my cleaning caddy down in the kitchen and went to check the bathroom for supplies. Couldn't have been gone for more than 30 seconds at the most. When I came back, my caddy was missing. I mean, how? I checked every room, thinking I might have absent-mindedly carried it somewhere else. But I didn't. I was getting frustrated until I happened to glance out the balcony window. There it was, my caddy perfectly balanced on a tree branch that extended near the building. The balcony door was locked from the inside. The windows were closed. I was on the 4th floor. I called my supervisor, claimed I couldn't complete the job because I'd forgotten crucial supplies. I took the hit on my paycheck rather than go back in that day. There were other incidents, faucets turning on by themselves, doors slamming despite no draft. One time my phone alarm went off with a voice note I never recorded, but I couldn't make anything out. But then the worst was what happened one month. That tenant left after just 6 weeks. A record. The apartment wasn't even dirty. Some dust, bathroom needed some attention, but nothing major. I was almost finished. I had just packed up my supplies, and I was heading right over to the door. I even had my hand on the doorknob when I felt something cold wrap around my ankles. Before I could even react, I was yanked backward with incredible force. My chin hit the hardwood floor and I bit my tongue. My cleaning caddy went flying. Whatever had me dragged me across the floor from the entryway through the living room. I clawed at the floor, almost breaking off my nails, trying to grab anything to stop myself. The thing pulled me into the master bedroom, then the bathroom, then back toward the 2nd bedroom. I was screaming like a madman the entire time, begging whatever it was to stop and let me go. Its grip was like iron, freezing cold pressure around both ankles that felt like hands, but larger. When it finally released me in the 2nd bedroom, I heard a new sound. A low, rumbling laugh that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Not amused, not friendly, but satisfied, like it had accomplished what it wanted. I scrambled to my feet and ran, leaving my supplies behind. I called my supervisor from the parking lot, voice shaking, and told them I wasn't going back to 412. I even threatened to quit, but they calmed me down and told me that I didn't have to go back to that apartment. Thank God. I ran into the guy who would be doing 412 for me from now on. I thought about warning him. Instead, I just wished him good luck and walked away. Some things you have to experience first to believe, and I've had my fill of that place. I still have terrible dreams about being dragged across the floor, and I still wake up from time to time, almost still feeling that cold pressure on my ankles. I've heard ghost stories throughout my whole life. They're interesting, yeah, but I never knew a ghost could nearly kill you. But maybe I'm just exaggerating. The Forbidden Restroom. From Lisa K. Do you guys also have your workplace ghost stories? Well, here's mine, and what it led to. I worked at this marketing place, an office building. HR went through all the usual orientation stuff with me. Benefits packages, organizational chart, building tour. But there was one oddity I still remember clearly. When the HR lady showed me where the restrooms were located, she pointed down the hallway and explained that the women's restroom was the 3rd door on the right. Then she added, almost casually, but with a peculiar seriousness beneath her smile, that most of the women prefer using the restroom on the 2nd floor. She didn't elaborate as to why, just mentioned it was more reliable, and gave me a knowing look before moving on to show me the break room. It took about a week before I asked my cubicle neighbor about this strange recommendation. We were walking to get coffee when I brought it up, asking why everyone avoided our floor's restroom, when it was clearly the most convenient one. She told me that there's been talk about the third-floor ladies' room being haunted for as long as she'd worked there. Almost 7 years now. The company had brought in maintenance multiple times to check for plumbing issues or electrical problems, which could explain the occurrences, but they never found anything wrong with the facilities. Eventually, management stopped investigating, and most employees just accepted the unspoken rule of using the second-floor restroom instead. Naturally, I needed to know more. My interest was piqued. She hesitated, then shared her own experience from when she first started. She had used the third-floor restroom before anyone had warned her about it. While in a stall, she heard soft crying coming from the stall next to hers. Thinking it was just someone having a rough day, she called out, asking if she was okay. The crying instantly stopped. When she finished and exited her stall, she checked the neighboring one, and it was empty. In fact, she realized she had been alone in that restroom the entire time. Over lunch that day, I decided to collect more stories, if there were any. A woman from accounting admitted she'd thought the haunted bathroom stuff was just office folklore, until her own encounter about 2 years ago. She considered herself a skeptic before then, and had deliberately used that restroom to prove everyone was being silly. While washing her hands, she clearly saw a woman with long dark hair standing behind her in the mirror's reflection. Kate turned around, but no one was there. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. She's used the second-floor restroom exclusively ever since. Other stories followed a pattern, indicating that people never felt or were alone in that restroom. Now, truth be told, I've always been fascinated by ghost stories. As a kid, I dragged my parents to supposedly haunted locations during vacations. In college, I joined the Paranormal Investigation Club, mostly as an excuse to explore abandoned buildings after dark. So, instead of being scared off by these tales, I was intrigued. One night, I had to stay late to finish a pitch deck for a client meeting. By around 9 p.m., the office was empty. Everyone else had gone home hours before. As I was saving my files and preparing to leave myself, I realized, probably foolishly, that this was the perfect opportunity to investigate the third-floor restroom without anyone else knowing. The hallway was dimly lit with just the security lights on. I pushed open the heavy door to the women's restroom and flipped on the light switch. It looked completely ordinary and clean. White tile floors, 4 stalls, 3 sinks with a large mirror, paper towel dispenser on the wall. Nothing ominous about it. I felt a little silly as I went about my business, using the first stall. No ghostly cries or anything like that. I washed my hands and checked the mirror periodically, but I didn't see anything. I smiled and thought to myself, so much for the office ghost. I dried off my hands and began to head for the exit. The door had one of those push plates instead of a handle, the kind you just lean into to open. I pressed against it, but it didn't budge. Thinking I wasn't pushing hard enough, I really put my shoulder into it. And still, nothing. The door felt like it was locked from the outside, which made no sense for a restroom door. And then, the lights went out. Not a flicker, not a gradual dimming, but an instantaneous blackout. There were no windows in that restroom, no other light source, so it was complete black darkness. My heart immediately began to race. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket to use as a flashlight, but it wouldn't turn on. I had been at the office all day, and it was dead. I felt stupid. I already knew it was dead before even coming to the bathroom, so why even try? I backed away from the door, feeling my way along the wall until I reached the corner. I sat down on the floor, trying to control my breathing. It's just an electrical issue, I told myself. The door stuck because some kind of pressure thing, because the ventilation's off too. But then I heard something. The soft, unmistakable sound of wet, bare feet on tile. The footsteps were slow. Slap, pause, slap, pause. They were moving across the bathroom floor towards me. I pulled my knees to my chest, making myself as small as possible. The footsteps got closer until they stopped right in front of me. So close I should have been able to feel someone standing there. I held my breath. I couldn't move, or didn't want to. Something cold brushed against my cheek then. Not quite a hand, more like fingers of mist. I squeezed my eyes shut, though it made no difference in that darkness. And all at once, the lights snapped back on with a harsh buzz. The sudden brightness was blinding. As my eyes adjusted, I saw that I was alone in that bathroom. But now the exit door was slightly ajar, swinging gently, as if someone had just gone through it. I got to my feet in record time and practically fell through the doorway, and I didn't stop until I reached the elevator. My hands were shaking as I gathered my things from my desk and left the building. The next day, I debated whether to tell anyone what happened. Part of me wondered if I'd just scared myself into imagining these things. But when I arrived at my desk, I found a small puddle of water below my chair, as if someone with wet feet had been sitting there, waiting for me. Yeah, I use the second floor restroom now. Some company traditions exist for a reason. So, guys and gals of the employed world, if you knew a bathroom was haunted at your workplace, would you go and use it on purpose? Would you attempt to throw a towel at the wet ghost girl? Or just take it easy in the not-so-haunted bathroom down the hall? That brings us to the end of this episode of Tales from the Break Room. Thanks for tuning in. I'll be back soon with more scary work stories for you. Until then, be sure to send me your scary work stories at eeriecast.com/submit and help us become the biggest scary story podcast in the world by following and reviewing Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thank you. Before I go, don't forget, my absolutely thrilling and brand new book is coming out July 8th, 2025. It's called Creepy Campfire Stories, and you can find it on Amazon right now for pre-order. This hardcover book is a gorgeous addition to your collection and contains a hand-picked archive of scary outdoors-related stories of the unexplained. The perfect campfire stories to tell around the campfire to make your next campout something your friends and family will never forget. Don't be a skinwalker.
Don't
Pre-order
miss out on
Creepy
amazing
Campfire
content.
Stories
Hit
today
that
on
subscribe
Amazon
button,
or click
turn
the
on
link in the
notification
description.
bell
I'm trying to
stay
get to
updated with our latest
2,500
videos.
pre-orders
Join our
before
community
July
today.
8th. Thank you.